I feel like there would be a bit of redundancy here in what was pronounced. But Rudolph, also known as Rudy, was one of 8 children born to parents James and Annie Featherstone on December 26, 1934. And he was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Rudolph Richard Featherstone, he always made a big R there when he wrote his name. An ordained pastor, described himself as a janitor for Jesus. Followed his calling as a faithful, unwavering, and obedient child of God. He attended Gettysburg College in the 1950s and was the first African American to graduate from Gettysburg College and was the only African American on the campus for his first 2 years of college. He is a graduate of Lutheran Theological Seminary in Gettysburg and a 1972 graduate of Harvard Youth Divinity School. Following his graduation from Lutheran Theological Seminary in Gettysburg, he served as pastor for 10 years at St. John's Lutheran Church in the Bronx, New York, Incarnation Lutheran in Jamaica, New York, and Good Shepherd Lutheran in Detroit. Through his work as pastor, he strengthened the relationship African Americans had with the Lutheran Church and local congregations. Featherstone was a powerful preacher as well as teacher throughout his career. After graduating from Howard Divinity School, he served in campus ministry at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as a mentor to students of color. His presence on campus led him to a position as professor at Trinity Lutheran Seminary, Bexley, Ohio. And here, he taught cross-cultural theological studies and mission. And among the courses he taught was the theology of Martin Luther King Jr. And in instruction and preaching, his powerful voice mimicked the voice of Dr. King. Throughout his entire career, Featherstone was dedicated to advocating for African American Lutherans. And Featherstone, with other ELCA teaching theologians of African descent, was involved in the Conference of International Black Lutherans, Civil, and spoke at commencements, presentations, convocations, including a Founders Day convocation at California Lutheran University in Thousand Oaks, California. His publications and presentations include The Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., A Tri-Dimensional Reality and Symbol, and Human Dignity in the Thought of Martin Luther King Jr. He embarked on numerous travels with African American colleagues in ministry to the continent of Africa and also South America as a servanthood commitment to mission and ministry abroad. On a light note, true to Rudy's character and humility, it was published once in the Columbus Dispatch local newspaper that he was the janitor at Trinity Lutheran Seminary. Following his self-introduction as janitor for Jesus, during an interview of another professor in college and ministry here at Trinity. Following his passing of his beloved wife, Carmela, Dr. Featherstone established the Carmela Walker Featherstone Memorial Endowment Fund. It is a scholarship held by the ELCA, providing for the studies of preferential African American women studying for Christian Word and Sacrament, or studying for post-MDiv academic work at Trinity Lutheran Seminary. The endowment scholarship reads, "The fund is intended as an expression of our thanksgiving and stewardship, with the hope that the ministries of Jesus Christ will be strengthened and extended in the life of this church. May his legacy continue to live on with this gift, and in his words, be a blessing to others in the name of Jesus Christ, as we have been blessed in his name. The family of Reverend Dr. Featherstone wishes to thank you for Rudy's recognition at the 33rd Annual Nelson W. Trout Lectureship. Reverend Dr. Rudolph Richard Featherstone, preacher, teacher, man of integrity, grace, humility, child of God, and of course, janitor for Jesus. Amen. Amen.
Gabriel, thank you so much for that remembrance, so that we can just have those moments to remember how much he meant to this place and the impact that he had on the students here and continues to have. So thank you. We will have another selection from the musicians, and then we will begin to get started with our lecture. I'll come up and walk through a couple of points, and then we'll have our lecture introduced. Thank you.
It's good to know that we are free to worship, free to give the Lord glory in any way that we express, whether it's lifting up our hands, opening up our mouth. I'm so glad to know that he's good to me, and we worship him today. We give you glory. You are wonderful, God.
Oh
able to worship and to be able to worship with such wonderful music. Thank you so much. Amen. So before we introduce our keynote speaker, there were a couple of things about the facility and about accessibility that I want to make sure that you know. You can enter and exit the building either through these doors or from the ground floor, if that's easier for you. There are restrooms on the ground floor, this floor, and the floor upstairs, all in the same location, down the hall and across from the elevators. There are refreshments, as you see, on this floor, and we'll have that this afternoon and also tomorrow morning for our early meet and greet before the second talk. Our meals, dinner this evening, and the closing luncheon will be served downstairs in the fellowship hall, promptly named Koinonia, for those of you who remember your biblical Greek. And if you like to do the stairs, that's the fastest way up and down, but you can also take the elevator if that's easiest for you. And as we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones so that we are all here in this space together. And at this time, I would like to welcome Dean Kleinhans back up to introduce our speaker. Kip, please. Thank you.
It is my great privilege today to be able to introduce our guest speaker and preacher of this evening's worship service, Reverend Dr. Teresa Smallwood. Lutherans have a lot to say about the relationship between law and gospel. And although Dr. Smallwood is not herself Lutheran, she is the embodiment of this intersection of law and gospel, as someone who holds both law and theology degrees. Teresa was born and raised in Windsor, North Carolina, in a rural community with her mother, father, and extended family. She says she grew up Baptist in a community that really leaned into the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. After high school, she enrolled in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts in Speech Communications and Afro-American Studies. And from there, she went on to North Carolina Central University School of Law, where she obtained her Juris Doctorate. She began her legal career with Legal Services of the Southern Piedmont in Trout, North Carolina, where she also works as staff attorney for the Children's Law Center. She served for 2 years as an assistant district attorney and then established a private practice in law that spanned 2 decades. And then, because God never stops calling us, she, like Dr. Featherstone before her, ended up at the Howard University School of Divinity, where she earned a Master of Divinity degree and then moved on to Chicago Theological Seminary to earn a PhD. She was licensed and ordained to public ministry while serving at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church in Lewiston, North Carolina, and has served in several other congregations of several different Christian traditions. She has taught at, it's an impressive list, Lancaster Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, the Religious Freedom Center in Washington, D.C., Chicago Theological Seminary in Chicago, and Philander Smith College in Little Rock, Arkansas. Before coming to United Lutheran Seminary in 2021, she served for 4 years as the postdoctoral fellow and associate director of the Public Theology and Racial Justice Initiative at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I will not do justice to the field of public theology. She can tell you much more, but my nickel explanation is public theology is the commitment that theology is not just for the church, but for the world. It is no surprise then that when she came to United Lutheran Seminary in 2021, she was hired as the James Franklin Kelly and Hope Eister Kelly Associate Professor of Public Theology. While at United, she shaped and is now the director of a new PhD program in public theology and witness, and has now for almost a year been serving as Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs. As we were planning for this event last summer already, we knew that this was an interesting time in public life in the United States, and it would become more interesting. Without knowing yet last summer and last fall how our national elections would go, we became convinced, or perhaps I should say I was convinced and convinced the rest of the planning committee, that Dr. Smallwood would have a word for us regardless of the election of the outcome, or the outcome of the election, and regardless of where we find ourselves now. Let me share just one quotable quote before you get to hear from her herself. She is, along with Emily Towns and Christoph Ringer, the editor of a volume called Moved by the Spirit, Religion and Movement for Black Lives. Her own chapter in that volume is called Their Words Became Flesh, which is a reflection on the Black Lives Matter movement. And she offers this succinct message. What does it mean for Black lives to matter? To make the claim that Black lives matter, one is tapping into a mystical structure established, I contend, by the Incarnation. The theological implication is that in the human condition, the life of Black people matters to God, and consequently, Black lives should matter to every other creature. I've had the joy of working with Dr. Smallwood and some theological education networks, and I'm really excited to welcome her here so that we can all hear from her work as a scholar. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Teresa Smallwood.
I would like to thank you all for being present, and I most definitely need to say a thank you for the exceptional hospitality that I have experienced. I want to speak very candidly that Mary Ann and Derek have shown me the love that I want to bring forth in all of the presentations that I'm thinking about. I've come to the conclusion, even though I will tell you I am unapologetically Black, I've come to the conclusion that God made us the way God made us so that we could understand the mosaic image of God. There's more than one color, more than one people. God has prepared for all the nations to be of one blood. And it makes me happy to be in a space where I know people understand that, right? We have been, I think, in our experiences in America in particular, but really all over the globe, we've been, thank you so much, brother. We have been made to think of ourselves in ways that cause us to not love others. And I cannot tell you how blessed I feel to have been here when Dr. Featherstone was being acknowledged, because Dr. Featherstone fits right into the same paradigm as the two people I came to talk about. We would do well to raise the glass to the memory of Nelson W. Trout. And I'm wanting to bring a little bit of light to Daniel Alexander Payne. I know that on the program it says E, and it might have been a mistake of mine that was made and carried on, but it's Daniel A. Payne. And I think that when you begin to see the caliber of man, when you begin to make the connection between people who didn't know each other, but who were operating in a particular spirit, then you'll get me, because what I'm really talking about is public theologian with prophetic witness. And I'm calling it Daniel A. Payne, public theologian with prophetic witness. But I'm using the example of Nelson Wesley Trout to think about that, to think about what the importance of such a statement might be in a moment like this. It behooves us all to recognize that if the people of God don't rise up, there's a lot to be said about what the devil have done when they rise up. And so the question about prophetic witness coupled with this idea of a public theologian is really where I'm going to park myself. Now, Nelson Strobert, Professor Emeritus in Religious Education at United Lutheran Seminary, he is still living actually in Gettysburg, wrote the seminal biography of Daniel Alexander Payne. And he characterizes Payne as the venerable preceptor of the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. I happen to be AME. And in that statement, Nelson is essentially saying that Payne, in his work, in his life, in the way in which he presented himself in the world, he brought about the significance of education to some degree, but the significance of being a strong churchman in the concept of an African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, I would say that Payne's connection with Lutheranism, particularly his presence in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the same as with others who've been named, as the first African American to attend Lutheran Theological Seminary in Gettysburg, which is now where I serve, United Lutheran Seminary, offers a less celebrated but equally important contribution to the work of racial equity in America. Payne's example aligns with the named honorific of the Trout Lectures, Reverend Dr. Nelson Wesley Trout, in that both men were pioneers in leadership and innovation in community building and academic excellence. This particular talk will highlight their legacies as instructive for our current times. The first time that I read about Trout was a reposting that Kit did in 2020 around, I think it was the Living Lutheran. And in that article it said the American Lutheran Church, a 2.3 million member denomination, formed largely of Scandinavian immigrants, elected its first black bishop. Now I know you all know how absolutely important that was. But can you imagine that in the year he was named, he in the 80s was the only black person to be named a bishop. And how many years did we wait to pass that report come along? Okay. Now he led a district that covered California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. Well, you know those states. He didn't have an easy job. 144,000 members. And he, of course, relocated to California. It was probably the best place for him to be. But this was after he had served as executive director of the Lutheran Social Services in Dayton and had been elected on the third ballot. Now, you Lutherans know what that means. I don't have a clue. And this article says that basically it was a unit that elected him to be this, and it made national news. I think that's very significant. And of course, in the article, there is mention of his background, but it doesn't take up the issue that in 1968, after the 67 riots that happened in Detroit, it was Nelson Wesley Trout who reflected on the condition of the world from his social vocation. And in that instance, he wrote this. This past summer, I visited Detroit, Newark, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and New York. One more part right there and say, he probably did it on his own dime. He goes on to say, it was interesting to note the unique character which marked the problem in each place. When you think about it, I would venture to guess that some of those same problems still exist. Now he says, for instance, in Detroit, I found people more or less unwilling to talk about the riot, which had happened July 23rd through 28th of 1967. In fact, they went about as if nothing had happened. At the site of much of the bombing, I found little children contentedly playing in the rubble. Adults walked by without as much as turning a head. He went on to say, as I traveled about the country, it appeared to me that the judgment of history is being executed in the streets of our cities. America is learning that you cannot violate God or neighbor with impunity. Let me just say, America was supposed to learn that. But I'm not sure we got the lesson. In the words of Gerald Revert, it's time for us to be a pupil. Because God is definitely our teacher. And I'm thinking that America has an F right now in the class of how to handle humanity. He said every ghetto in America is a solemn sign of the cumulative yet deliberate sins of flesh against flesh, of humanity against humanity, and yes, of Americans against America and Americans. He said at the site of much of the bombing, people were just absolutely happenstance. And in his movement, he found that people were comparing human beings and the growth of human beings to the growth of a mighty oak. But he said, you know, a mighty oak can't be built in a 2-gallon pail. Either the oak will be stunted and will eventually wither and die from the lack of sustenance, or else its roots will be burst through. And the limitations found in the soil to which they will grow and expand. The analogy is not exact, he says, but it does rightly suggest that the seeking, searching, inspiring spirit cannot be confined. It must be free to achieve the fullest possibilities. And so it was that he was reflecting on the issue of joblessness, all the hardcore problems problems, even though he was an academic. And I think that's very exceptional to see our theological work in light of the societal problems that we see. But as he reflected, he constantly came back to the fact that we're agents of God. We're the image of God. And we are to handle God's humanity in a different way than what we're doing. Public theology as a discipline is relatively new. Martin E. Marty, recently deceased luminary at the University of Chicago, is credited with introducing the concept of a public church. Many scholars over the last 50 years have added to its understanding. And when we teach students at United Lutheran Seminary the introduction course to public theology, we're teaching them to understand that we immerse them in the theoretical framework of public theology as a theological telos, in which the quest for social, racial, economic, and legal justice requires of its proponents the development of programs to address a common public life. Now that phraseology, a common public life, comes from Linnell E. Cady, who wrote a book about this idea of public theology. And we're thinking in terms of a common public life for all of God's children, for all citizens. While centering the role of faith in seeking to address and eradicate injustices faced by multiracial members in our society, we emphasize the role of prophetic activism and prophetic imagination. Many people know that terminology, prophetic imagination, from Walter Brueggemann. But prophetic activism is just what it sounds like. God is moving you to do something. Thus, the lens of public theology, defined broadly, is to include wide publics and pluralistic knowledges of theological grounding. Well, what do I mean, pluralistic groundings? You know, when I was growing up in the Baptist church, it wasn't hard for you to know that Baptist was the only way, because they would put down everybody else. But I don't believe that's godly. I believe the godly way is to acknowledge that God will reveal God's self through whatever mechanism God desires. And we should have the respect for God that allows us to receive this God in everyone. When we think about this sort of broad definition, we have to recognize that presently there's a critical need for training newly minted and often young leaders to enter the discourse on justice on all fronts. But I want to make clear that I'm not talking about the world's justice, because our criminal court system, criminal so-called justice system is hardly just for a lot of people. I'm speaking of God's justice. And if I had another lecture tacked on to the two I'm doing, I would break that down for you. But the bottom line is, understand that God's justice is very different from what we are practicing in the world. So what we mean then is that when you think in terms of provoking students to examine and critique social practices and cultural understandings, we're literally trying to teach people that you can't even be a public theologian if you don't have cultural competence to know who it is you're speaking to. Because if you're not competent, you will say something that will turn them off, and then there will be no way for what you have to say to make any kind of change, any kind of transformation in that life. So we hope that our students will learn to identify a justice platform that resists the tensions that are clear in this world and bring forth the kinds in paradigms as it relates to racism, sexism, economic violence, societal systems, because really and truly all of the societal systems have an overlay of a kind of enslavement mentality. And so it is then that we expect our students to take race and class and address it theoretically through these sociological and historical and theological readings that we give them. In essence, then, that is what I mean by public theology. Now, as it relates to Daniel Alexander Payne, this is a painting that hangs right outside my door in my office at United Lutheran. This is him for the first time meeting Samuel Simon Smucker, who was the person who basically broke down all kinds of walls when it comes to race. And Smucker is the one who founded Gettysburg College and then subsequently founded the Lutheran Seminary at Gettysburg. But when it comes to looking at Daniel Alexander Payne, he wrote an autobiography. And it was entitled Recollection of 70 Years, and that he was saying he was born to free parents in Charleston, South Carolina on the 24th of February, 1811. But think about that. He was born to free parents in Charleston, South Carolina in 1811. We didn't get the Emancipation Proclamation until, what, 50 years later, 54 years later? His parents, Martha and London Payne, were members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Both parents died when Payne was but a young boy. I think his mother died when he was 4, his father died when he was 9, so he was picked up by an aunt who raised him. And he worked at the age of 13 to learn carpentry. And this is what he says in his biography. It was during the time that I was in carpenter's shop that I came into possession of the first number of what was then known as the Self-Interpreting Bible by Reverend John Brown of Haddington, Scotland. It was prefaced with a biographical sketch of this great man. The reading of this became the turning point of my life, for after reading it, I came to the conclusion to try and be what he was. I said to myself, if Brown learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew without a living teacher, why can't I? This question was answered by our Trout. Up to that hour, I had never seen a book in Latin, Greek, or Hebrew, but I resolved, as soon as I could get them to study, while I would read every book within my reach, among which was the Scottish Chiefs. Then at 18 years of age, Payne converted, having devoted himself to prayer in his youth. And this is a conversion that happens with the Methodist Church. And then he wrote, God heard our songs of praise. And let me just say, gracious in the morning. Hallelujah for the gifts in the house. Hallelujah. He says, God heard our songs of praise, our prayers of faith, poured out his awakening and converting power. Listen to this. It poured out his awakening and converting power upon his waiting children, and many souls were converted and sanctified by it. Of this number I was one. Here too I gave him my whole heart, and instantly felt that peace which passeth all understanding, and that joy which is unspeakable and full of glory. He goes on to say, it was in that moment I set apart myself to educate myself in order that I might educate others. And he speaks of this as being an inclination of the Holy Spirit. I hope you're getting where I'm coming from. As it relates to Payne, his thirst for a means to educate his people is undeniable. He was relentless in his self-taught consciousness. Once he realized the value of education to form one's worldview, he was convinced that it should be the right of all people to learn. And this was a fundamental value of Daniel Alexander Payne. Education became Payne's prophetic witness, and when he encountered a world that vehemently sought to stop him from educating others, his first school, of course, opened in 1829 with 3 children and 3 adults. The tuition was 50 cents per pupil per month. And he faced widespread opposition, found he had to close the school due to, get this kid, legal maneuvers. But his commitment to educate the people never waned. He went on to further educate himself and reopened his school and continued the trend towards educating black people as a lifelong endeavor. Now, I want to focus Payne in connection with Trout, because both of them spent their lives, you understand? Trout spent his life committed to educating people. And I want to say that there is absolutely no better convention, no better vocation, no better opportunity to spread the love and justice of God than to open people's minds, to open people's minds, to open people's minds. Concern for people, not black people, not white people, not BIPOC people, but people as a whole. That's the concept by which many scholars, and particularly the scholars we're thinking about. Because understand, if white folks hadn't opened their doors and arms, Payne would not have been able to be at that school. And can I just stop and say to you that when we think in terms of people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was dealing with the concept of the Negro problem, that's because he was in the midst of a Harvard education and he heard his own professor had written an article in the Atlantic Quarterly. And that article by Nathaniel Southgate Shaler is what wrote the terminology, the Negro problem. And it was W.E.B. Du Bois's insistence that he meet that statement. And it ends up being an important essay in the souls of black folks. Now, Shaler writes in 1888, I do believe, and his article appears, and it wasn't just Du Bois who took up this issue of the Negro problem. What does it mean to be a problem? Du Bois obviously did his work in a very scholarly manner, but let me tell you, there were others. Paul Laurence Dunbar took it up. He took it up in his aesthetics. Others took up that issue, and the next thing you know, there was a whole volume printed about what the Negro wants. So many of our ancestors were convicted that if we act like white folks, maybe they'll accept us. And you can talk all you want to all day long about whether or not that was a right premise. But the truth of the matter is they were thinking, critical thinking people who at the very least understood what it meant to get out of the trouble that causes them to be a problem. And the bottom line for me is that they weren't just thinking of themselves. They had the whole community on their hearts and minds. What does it mean for all of us to escape the dead clothes, the clothes of the dead folks, and become people who have been renewed by the promises of God? They felt all of them, all of these 3 men that we talked about and heard about today. They understood that if people could be educated, they wouldn't be a problem. I still believe it. But concern for the whole people was not a concept that everybody agreed upon.
In fact, when Shayla wrote his article, he was suggesting that because people have been now emancipated, we got a problem. Because now they know they're human. Now they know they have the same rights as everybody else. Now they know. And very soon they will try to operate in a particular freedom. And I'm not sure we want that. Now, I want you to take, for instance, someone like Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr